Good morning. Welcome to Studio Time with Deb, the online version. Today we are going to talk about cleaning up solder blobs. I know none of you ever have this, and it's not an issue. It'll be a fun class anyway. This class is about excess solder removal. So I've been thinking a lot about filing, and last week I talked to you a little bit about finish filing. And I was in my studio and I was working, and I realized that I talked about finish filing and shape filing, and I didn't really differentiate. Shape filing, I usually use really coarse files, and it's just to get the outside shape or to really, rip something down fast, or maybe I'll do a thing on that later. But I did talk about the finish filing. So then as I was cleaning up some solder, I realized that solder cleanup is a whole animal in and of itself. And the way I clean that up is really different than handling just about anything else. So I thought I'd do a little segment on that and explain to you what the differences are and why. So solder cleanup, let me tell you the first thing about solder cleanup. Number one is, if you don't make a mess, you don't have to clean it up. So number one is, don't make the mess. Use less solder than you think you need. It is better to solder several times with not enough solder than once with too much. You need to plan your solder joints. One of the things that I think people don't do when they are soldering is to think about what happens when it doesn't go the way you want it to go. What happens when the solder goes somewhere else, either because it goes on the small piece and you wanted it on the big piece, or because it goes into a corner and you didn't want it to. What you have to think about when you're planning your solder joints and when you're planning where to put your solder is, how am I going to clean this up when it messes up? Because you can spend hours trying to get solder out of a place that's almost impossible, right? So you have to think about what's going to happen. Can you get to it after the fact? Can you get to where there's an issue or a problem or something going on? And if you can't get to that, then figure out another way to solder. A lot of times what you can do is that you could put solder onto the smaller part, pre-flow it on there, and put the pieces together. Heat only the big part until you see that solder flow. That's a good way to prevent a mess. If the solder, when it goes on the little part, goes in places you don't want it to, it's not together. So you can get in there, you can clean it off all except for those surfaces that are going to touch. So there's a lot of ways that you can prevent the mess. Another thing that I do want to tell you about is that you never, ever, ever want to file a piece that has flux on it. So after you've done your soldering, if you need to clean that up, you can choose to pickle it, and that's fine. If you don't want to pickle it for whatever reason, say you've got a lot of solder joints or you've got something that's relatively fragile in there and you don't want to do repeated pickling, flux will come off with hot water. It takes a little bit longer, and sometimes you have to scrub at it a little bit, but it will come off with hot water. The oxides won't come off, but a lot of times that you don't really care at that point. You can do that later. So you don't always have to pickle. You can use the hot water, take the flux off. So what I did was that I took some pieces of copper for you, and I flowed some solder blobs on them. I just made blobs, and I cleaned them off. So I'm going to talk to you first. I'm going to share screen share right now. I'm going to talk to you first about the tools that I use to clean the solder off and why and how they work. So one of the first things I use is files. And these are both fine files. Now, when Susan and I were talking this week, and she said that I say fine file, coarse file, and I don't give you numbers. One of the reasons I don't give you numbers all the time is because, number one, I don't know what the numbers are. But number two is that I have a lot of files from different places and different sources. And what's a number 4 file from one company is different than a number 4 file from another company. So these are both number 4s, but the top one, it's a really narrow file. It has 2 safe edges. Both of the other sides are safe edges. It feels like a number 6 to me. It's a very fine file. It says it's a number 4. The bottom one is one of the ones from Stuller. It's a Barrett file, and it is a number 4. So giving you a number doesn't always tell you what really how coarse it is. And so I tell you fine and coarse so that you can kind of feel it and see what I'm talking about, what I'm using. So these are both files that I use. One of the things I want you to note about both of these files is how narrow they are. And the reason for that is that when I am filing on a blob of solder, I don't really want a file that's wide. I want a file that's long, because remember that with each stroke, I can get a lot of work done if it's long, but if it's wide, I stand a good chance of filing my base sheet, which I don't really want to do because then I have to get that mess out. So I also use these. These are the nail file sanding sticks. There's a couple things I want you to note about these. Number one is the blue one and the pink one are pretty torn up. They're replaceable, right? I can peel this off, put another one on. One thing to note about these too is that they have a foam backing on them, and that makes them a little bit soft. So you need to be a little bit careful that you're not going to round edges with them. But the other thing that I want you to note is that because I am right-handed, if you look, when I put these on, I bias them heavily to the right side here. Okay, and this one too, you can see it's got a lot more space here and it's biased over here. The reason I do that is because when I'm sanding with it, I can get right up in the crack or right up into a corner. Okay, and I don't use the left side as much. I use the right side because I'm right-handed. If you're left-handed, you're going to reverse this. But I bias those way over to the side like that. And occasionally, not often, but occasionally, I will even hang it off the side. I use these a lot. The advantage of these is that those belts are movable. So I can use all the belt all the way around, all the little space on it. They come finer than this. There's even a 1200 that you can get. And they're spring loaded, so you can, put them on and off pretty easily and change them around pretty easily. The thing I like about these is that they've got a hard surface in the back. And so this plastic part is really hard. And then it's got the little pointed area. So I can take that, if I get solder up into a corner or something that's hard to reach, I can pull the belt over to one side a little bit, and then I can sit there and work that corner with something that's hard like this so I can get it done quickly. And that'll give me a good, clean, sure way to clean things up.
What are those called?
These are, Rio sells a different batch now. They don't sell these. I would just look under sanding sticks and see if they have them.
Okay.
I can find a link for you if you email me and ask me. And I'll find
Micromark has them.
Micromark will have them. Stuller has them. Rio has them. I think most of the jewelry supply places have them now. Last week or the week before, I gave you a link to Guess One that has the belts that are much finer. I don't like the clear belts in these grits. I don't think they hold up as well. I don't think they're as good. So I get these belts from Stuller, but the finer belts only come in the clear ones. And they work pretty well for the really, really fine ones. These are called Tam OShanter stones or Scotch stones. And the top one is a pumice stone from a nail file store. The bottom one is Jewelry Supply. They're a little bit hard to find. I think Tevel carries them. But they come in different grits and different sizes. And one of the advantages of these is that if you have something that's in a tiny little area, you can shape the end of this stone. So if I take a really coarse file, I could make the end of that stone just a cone shape, a circular pointed cone shape, so that I can get into a really tiny area to clean it up. And then, like I said, they come from coarse to fine, and you can get whatever you need. These are Riffler files. So Riffler files are expensive little files. I like the Grobet #4 cut, and they are almost impossible to find now. I think Grobet quit making the 4 cuts. I think they still make 2. But I have the bottom one that you see here is a 0 cut, and the top one is a 4 cut. I use the 4 cuts a lot more than the coarse ones, but if I'm going to be removing a solder blob from a sheet, the bottom one is a good place to start. I wouldn't end there because it's going to put pretty deep scratches into my metal if I go deep enough. But it will remove the solder a lot faster than if I used a 4 cut. So one of the things with removing solder for any of these is that you want to be as aggressive as possible in a tiny, tiny limited area. So I'm going to show you a little bit more about the Riffler files. This is a close-up. So that top one is a 4 cut. That'll tell you a little bit. That bottom one is a 0 cut. Here's another look at them. Okay, because mess ups happen, because that's just how life is, we need a way to deal with this. We need a way to fix the mistakes, right? So there's several things that you need to be careful about. And one is not doing more damage. So a solder blob is something that's up on top of the metal. I need to be very careful when I'm working that I don't do anything that'll dig a gouge into the metal, because if I dig a gouge, now not only do I have to remove the upper blob, but I have to remove all of the metal down to that gouge. So if I don't, like I said in the first place, if I don't make the mess in the first place, I don't have to clean it up. But say I've got solder on there and I've got to clean that up. I don't want to make more work for myself by digging a gouge in there. So I need to be very careful about the tools I'm using and how I'm using them. So I made a video for you. I'm going to play the video for you. Let me know what you think and we'll get started. Are there any questions before I start the video? All right.
There's a lot of ways that I can attack these. And one of the things I want to do is to minimize the damage to the other part of the sheet, right? I don't want my cleanup to be any more than it absolutely has to be. So if I have a piece that I can easily take and bend a little bit, what I will do is to take this and I will arch it just a little bit. I'll put my thumbs in here and I'll arch it. Not a lot, just a little bit, so that I make that solder area the highest area on there. And if I do that, then I can come in with a file. So last week I talked to you about using a file that is the biggest file that's reasonable for the job. This one is long, but it's very narrow. And that works for me because my solder blob, it's about the same width as my solder blob. That way I can keep the file on the solder and not have it hit the rest of the metal. So if I'm coming along here, and by arching it a little bit, I'm not hitting here or here. I'm just hitting on the solder itself. If it's not arched enough, I'll arch it a little bit more. And what I want to do is to remove most of that solder. I don't have to remove all of it, but I want to remove most of it with the file. You can see on this, occasionally I've hit the other side a little bit, but not much at all. And so it's not much to clean up. So I'm going to show you what happens if I use a file that's too wide. This one will work, and it's a little bit coarser file, which is nice. But if I miss, look what I've done. I've dug a gouge in here. So now not only do I have to remove the solder, but I also have to remove this gouge. So if I don't make a gouge in the first place, then I'm good to go. So what I want to do is to use a narrower file so that I stay right on that solder, right there. And I want to go until I am almost seeing copper through it. So now this is a little harder when it's silver on silver, but you can tell when the solder's gone. And I want to go until that solder is almost gone. Not quite, but almost. I would say 95% gone. Okay, so I'm working on this. Occasionally I come back, I recurve it if I need to. But you can see already it's a lot gone. It's much flatter, right? Okay, so I'm going to do a little bit more. This is a very fine file that I'm using. I could use a coarser file, but the problem with a coarser file is if I slip, then I've got a problem. Where with a really fine file, if I slip, it's probably pretty easily recoverable. So I want to keep going. I intentionally made these solder blobs pretty big. I want to keep going until this is almost flush. And I'm almost there. I am filing around it a little bit, but no gouges, no big gouges at all. It's pretty flat. Okay, I can still feel it, so it's still more solder than I want. I can also use my number 2 cut Barrett file, the relatively small one, the 8-inch. That one would work also. And I want a 2 cut because I want to be more aggressive, but see how this one fits in? And it's really easy to control. So I want something where I'm primarily just hitting the solder, nothing else. Just right on that solder. A little bit more, and then what I'm going to do is come in with sandpaper. Now when I do sandpaper, I've got a couple of choices. And depending on how flat I want this, I might use the sanding belt ones, the ones that come in different grits, and I might use the nail file ones. So the sanding belt ones start at, I think, 120 grit. The nail files start at 80 grit. If I want to take this and try to smooth the whole thing in, the whole thing together, then what I'm going to do is I probably would use the 80 grit of the nail files. This is almost there. One of the big mistakes that most students make, that many students make, is to not use a coarse enough file or a coarse enough sandpaper, because they think that if they do coarse sandpaper, they're making more scratches and they're going to make a mess and it's not going to work. And the problem with that is you can do it with a finer sandpaper, but it's just going to take you forever to get through it. So I want to use a file first for most of the way. Almost there. Notice occasionally I switch directions. That's because I can see better what's going on if I switch directions. So I was filing this way and now I'm filing this way. And it's not a lot different, it's just a little bit different. Okay, it's getting now to where it's pretty much down there. All right, I'm going to switch to sandpaper. So you can see, if you look at this, you can see that a lot of it, I can see a separation here, but most of this is pretty much down to almost level with the sheet metal. So what I'm going to do, looking at that, I would go to the 80 grit nail file. Now I'm going to do 80 grit because I can just file this upper area. If I was filing the whole sheet, I wouldn't do that. And the reason I wouldn't do that is because I don't want to clean it up from these areas that aren't messy. But because I can round the sheet a little bit, I can come in here and just file this high area. Okay, I can still see the solder. All right. and I want to sand until, again, the solder is just, there might be a touch of it left, but I can see that it's going to disappear. So the blob is getting smaller and smaller as I sand. Okay, and that's excellent. So what I'm going to do is keep working it. If I come in here with a flex shaft, what's going to happen is I'll dig gouges in it, and then getting this sheet flat again is going to be darn near impossible. So I don't really want to do that. What I want to do is to try to keep it relatively flat in my working it. So that's why I'm going to use files and sandpaper that's on a stick. Can you see that solder is getting smaller and smaller? Okay, so I'm getting there. I'm almost there. There it goes. See, it's smaller yet. Okay, a little bit more. Now, when I go down to the next sandpaper, it's important that I work my way down in the grits. If I go from this, from the 80 grit, down to 400 grit, again, that's going to take me forever to get those marks out. But if I go from 80 grit to 120 to 220, and sometimes I skip a few, but not a lot. So you can see already, see how much smaller that solder is? Okay, so it's almost gone. I'm going to do a little bit more with the 80. Oh, I think I'm pretty much done with 80. So there's a tiny piece left there, but not much. I'm going to go down to, what is this one? 120, I think. So I'm going to go the other direction now. I'm going to go like this. And that's partly because I can get my sanding marks out. Now that file mark that I put in there earlier with the wider file, I'm probably not going to get out at all. It's probably, see, it's right there. It's going to stay there. See it? It's right there. The way I would have to get that out is to sand the entire sheet down to that level. And I'm not going to do that. So, and that's the reason we don't want to use a larger file like that. So I'm going against my sanding marks that I put in last time with the 80 grit. And I'm looking to be sure those are all gone. And they are over in here, but not in here. So I'm going to turn it around. I'm going to do it some more. All right. So my solder is long gone. There's no solder on there anymore at all. It's gone. I still have that mark that I made with the file, so that's why I want to be really careful to not do that. So the next thing I'm going to do is go down to I'm going to go down to 320. Okay. And this gets faster and faster and easier as you go down in grits. I do want to be careful that I don't round these corners. And with this, it's hard. It's a little easy to do because they're padded. They're a little bit soft. You have to be careful to keep the pressure on the metal itself, not on the edge, and not doing this kind of thing where you're lifting up. You want to really keep it down. All right, that's looking really good. I'm going to flip this around. Now, a lot of times I will stop at 320 and I will continue with that. I do clean up after every solder joint every time. I don't go all the way down to like a high polish every time. What I do is go down to about 320 every time, because at 320 I can see if there's any big flaws. 320 is a pretty fine. And if there's anything big, I can take care of it. And if there's not anything big, then I can go on and then start there from the next finishing point. So this is looking really good. The solder's gone. I still have that file mark. Look at that file mark. That would take me a long time to get that file mark out of there. That's why we don't do that. Okay, I'm going to show you a couple other ways to do this. This way that I'm going to show you is a little bit hazardous. You got to be really careful. So I've got a big solder blob here. Let's do this one in the back because it's even bigger. This one, I got a big solder blob there. What I can do is to take my white advantage wheel, which is now an Eve wheel, I understand, on the flex shaft, and I can grind that down a little bit. Now, I just told you not to use a flex shaft. The reason that I can use a flex shaft here, if I'm very careful, is that I will use it to remove the preliminary material, like I did with the file. So what I will do, I'm going to use it like a file. I'm just going to leave it right on the solder. I'm not going to let it slip off the solder at all. I want you to look how I'm holding everything. I have a thumb here, a finger here. My other fingers are under the bench pin or to the side of the bench pin, so that makes this very stable. And then I put a finger over here so that my flex shaft is very stable. And I want to work only on the solder. And I do not want to grind so much that I see the copper through there. I only want to grind where the solder is.
Deb, what kind of speed are you using on the flex shaft?
Kind of a moderate speed. Shelley, no, I don't bend the metal. What I want to point out to you guys right now, I'm stopping this because look at this wheel. This wheel is a little bit crooked because I probably used it on something else. And what happens, and you'll see it later in the video, is that I caught this corner on the sheet metal and it did make a gouge. If I had been, what I should have done is to use one of the wheels that was half this width. This one is way too wide for what is going on that solder blob. This one would have fit this solder blob because it's wider. This one was much taller. These are big pieces of solder, guys. They were just under 1/4 inch, so they were big. But because this is slanted, you'll see as this continues that I caught it. So Janice, moderate speed. I don't usually use a flex shaft full out. I do kind of moderate speed unless there's a reason I need to go slow. Any other questions before I continue? Okay.
What is the wheel?
It's a white advantage wheel, which now they call Eve wheels, EVE. But it's the white one. Okay.
And when I think I'm getting close to the copper, I'm going to quit, but I'm not there yet. Okay, I'm getting really close now. Okay, and you can see that it's lumpy. See, it's not flat. It's a kind of a lumpy, it's a lumpy look. And that's okay for the solder. I don't care if the solder's lumpy. I do very much care if it's lumpy when I finish. So this is just the preliminary part. A lot of times I'll turn it 90 degrees because I'm working with my wheel at a little bit of an angle, and so I can get these sides a little bit better. Okay, still I haven't broken through at all. I'm close. I'm really close, but I have not broken through the solder at all. So I can look at it, see there's a little bit of a high area right here. I'm getting really close though, so I need to be very careful because I really don't want to break through. Okay, I'm going to quit. Okay, so then I can choose to either come in with a file. Let's say on this one I can't bend the metal for whatever reason. I can't do that. So I could come in. These I also really like. These are the belt sander ones, and they've got replaceable belts, and the belts move. These are spring loaded right here, so you can push on them and spring them, and then you can move the belt around some. So if I do this, one of the things I like about these is that it's really hard plastic, and I can use this end and sand right here on top of that solder. So this one is a 120, I believe. Yeah, 120 grit. So I'm going to sand right on top of that solder. Now I use pretty big pieces of solder on this just so that I could really show you. And normally I don't think you'll have this big a mess, but you might. It can happen, huh? See, I can put a lot of pressure on this. And then if my sandpaper gets worn out right here, I just take it and I can move it around. I can slide the belt around a little bit to get a fresh place. And then I have fresh sandpaper. And these belts last for quite a while. I'm pretty impressed with this setup. They also get into relatively small places, which is nice. And you can see I don't have to work the whole sheet. I'm working just that solder joint. Or not joint, just the solder blob. And it could be a solder joint too. I mean, it could be. Okay. I don't love sanding, which is one reason that I'm kind of aggressive with it. But aggressive in small places, and then that way I can get it done and over with. Okay, it's starting to get smaller and smaller. I'm going to move the belt again just a little bit. Get a fresh place on it. And again, I turned my piece 90 degrees. Did you see that? And I can see a little bit better what's going on here. Okay, my solder is getting really small now. Yeah, my solder is getting very small. It's almost gone. So I don't know if you can see with it's much smaller than it was.
So one thing I want you to note on this is that the solder is smaller, but look, I've got a mess in this area as far as what I've sanded. I haven't sanded the rest of the sheet. The rest of the sheet is okay. So what a lot of people make a mistake of is you think that because I use the 120 paper, because you use 120, you're going to have sanding marks all over the place. You don't have to. You have them right in here. And if you're not quite as sloppy as I am, you could make it even a smaller area. So you can really refine your sanding to something that's smaller, and then it's not so difficult to clean up from there.
Yeah. So I'm going to go ahead before I go any further and go down to the 240 belt. Okay. And then I'm going to go this way. Now, this way I'm removing my scratches from the 120 belt, and still removing that solder all at the same time. So it's kind of dual purpose. If I did all the way down with the 120 belt till it was completely gone, then I would have to get all those out, and I would remove it even further. So what I'm going to do, and then I'm going the other direction. Oh, look. So right here, can you see that? Yes, you can. See that mark? That's where I slipped with the wheel. That's one reason I tell you not to use wheels, because it is so easy to slip. There's times you can get away with it. There's times you can't. But that's another one now I would have to clean up entirely. I'd have to sand this until that gouge is gone. Gouges are much harder to clean up because I've got to sand everything all the way around it to get that gouge out. Okay, the solder is gone at this point. So then I would just go down finer and finer until it's, this is 400, until it's what I want to solder on for the next joint. If this was a finished piece, I would need to get that gouge out. And that's why I got to be very careful. And it's coming out, but the solder is gone. Okay, so this is another big blob of solder. I'm going to tell you a couple other ways to deal with this. Again, so this is called a Tam OShanter Stone. This one, they're hard to find. I know Tevel has some. You can use, this is from a nail file store, and it's a pumice stone of some sort. And they're okay too. They're a little coarser, I think. You can get the Tam OShanter stones, also called Scotch stones, in lots of different grits. I've got at least 3 different grits, and they're different sizes too. There's big fat ones and there's little skinny ones. These will also take solder away. This is going to take me a long time, so I'm not going to do it for very long, but I'll show you. So what this does,
Deb, do you have to use water with the Scotch stones?
The Scotch Stone will last a lot longer if you use water with it, especially the fine one. But I often use them dry. They're a little bit more aggressive if you use them dry. This pumice stone is pretty aggressive. And you'll be able to see, I'll show you after I grind with it a little bit, you'll be able to see how much metal I removed with it. So it kind of depends on what you're doing. If I'm doing a finished thing, say I've got most of the marks gone with a file or with one of the sanding sticks, and then I want to come in with a pumice stone for a final, because it's even finer than 600, the fine ones are. So then I might use it with water.
basically just a stone, so that it's a little bit more aggressive than, say, sandpaper. But it's not so aggressive. Plus, I'm holding it in my hand, so if it's a place that's hard to get to, or that that I need to be careful of the surrounding, this is easy for me to control. I can also take a really wicked file and I can shape this. So if I need something with a sharp point on it, I can do that. If I need something that's rounded, I can do that. I can make it be whatever I want it to be and whatever I need it to be to get rid of the solder. So I would just keep this up until that solder is gone. And one more method I'm going to show you is, this is a riffler file right here. And it doesn't have any teeth on the back side here. It has teeth only here. This is a coarse one. This is a number 0. Normally I use 4s, and because I use them for finish filing. But since this one is not finish filing, this one is to get this off. I would do this, and because it's rounded, I can work just back and forth right here on top of that. And we can use this in little places where we can't get to other things. And you can't easily get other tools in there or other files. And you can see it's moderately aggressive, but I can work right on top of it. I can work right on top of it. Until I've removed enough to go to the sandpaper. So this one obviously is still big. There's not removed, but it's getting there. So that's about removing some solder blobs.
Deb,
Yes.
what do you use to shape the Scotch stone? Do you shape it with just any file, or do you have to protect your file when you?
Oh, Scotch Stone is nasty for a file. So what you're going to want to do is to use one of the wicked files. I have a file in each drawer that I use to shape advantage wheels and stuff. So it's not really good for a file anymore. It's only good for shaping things and nasty things I do to it. So I would use that. I would use something like that.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, it's aggressive and it will harm your files. If I'm filing sanding directly on a joint, how do I know when to stop? You obviously don't want to remove all the solder in that case. So if I'm filing directly on a solder joint, say it's a butt joint, I don't want to see any solder at all. If it's a good fit, I shouldn't see any solder at all. If it's a T-joint, something like that, I'll use a Riffler file that's one of the ones with the triangular ones that I can just get down in there. I avoid doing ones that I can't clean up every now and then. I avoid doing anything that is, and that's what I mean by planning your solder joints. So if I have a square corner and I want to solder that onto something like that, I want to solder that on, I'm going to be sure my solder is on the outside, not on the inside of that corner, because cleaning up an inside of the corner is very difficult. And cleaning up the outside of a corner is no big deal. That's a T-joint, basically. So I have to think about what's going to happen and how I can get there and how I can clean it up. And if I need to file, how am I going to clean up the file marks? Can I get a sanding stick in there? Can I get, what can I do after the fact? So a lot of times the planning of the solder joint is more important. The cleanup is what happens if everything else goes awry.
So those new little sanding twig things that you turned us on to, are those good for that kind of getting into tiny places?
They are. The problem with them is they're a little bit tall. So if I have, say, a wire that's attached to a sheet and I get solder spillover on the sheet up here, I need something tiny, tiny to get in there, right? I can't, and that's an instance that I would probably pre-flow the solder here. If it slips around to here, I would clean this up prior to trying to solder. Then I would put it together and I'd put most of my heat up in here on the sheet so that this one, when it gets hot, remember, because when you're soldering, the trick is that they both have to be to the flow point of the solder at the same time. So if I have a little piece and a big piece, I flow it on the little piece. I make sure that it's exactly where I want it. I put them together, lots of flux. And then what I'm going to do is heat the big piece until I see that solder flow. And then I don't have a mess. The twigs are great for narrow spaces, but they're still tall because they still have that foam in the middle and they have two sides of them. So they're good for narrow things. And you can get them like right up next to bezels and stuff a little bit easier. But you can't get them into tiny little areas necessarily. Sometimes the microfiles will work, the ones that are like 3 inches long that, are painful. The other thing that you could do if you want to clean that area up is to take some of the clear sandpaper, the acetate, is it acetate? Acetate stuff. And you cut it into really skinny strips about 1/8 of an inch wide and chuck it up in your saw frame. And then with your saw, get in there but it's sandpaper. And you can sand back and forth with that. And sometimes that'll get it out. That takes forever to do. So you really don't want a big slaughter blob if that's an issue, because that's just going to take you days. I do want to make a note for you guys that video was 25 minutes long and I cleaned up 2.5 solder blobs that were big solder blobs. So it really doesn't take you that long. And that was pretty much actual time. It doesn't take that long to do that, as long as you're paying attention and you do it do things in the right order, you're aggressive enough and you don't make such a big mess that you have to clean up the mess and the solder. So it really goes pretty fast.
Deb?
Yeah.
I use these, which are sanding paper on large files. I find them amazing.
I've never been fond of them for flat areas. I use them sometimes inside rings. It's just, but if it works for you, I think that's great. And it's probably worth people trying. For those of you who don't know, it's a mandrel and it has a split up the middle. And then you can put different size sandpapers in there and it's kind of a flap wheel.
Actually, these are already, it's already put together. There's no, yeah, you can get them from Rio.
Yeah.
They're buffing.
So the only problem with the already put together ones is then that is behaving like a wheel. And anytime I've got a sheet that's absolutely flat, and I've got a round wheel that's going on there, it's going to tend to dig gouges. And you got to be really careful about that. That one, because it's long, because it's really wide, is going to tend to dig linear gouges as opposed to small gouges. So if I want something really pristine flat, that is probably not going to do it. But it could be a good way to remove the preliminary solder. It could be really good for that. So just watch. I think part of this is that I really want you to pay attention to the small details, that if I want a flat sheet, I want it pristine flat. I don't want it flat with a few rumples. I want it pristine. And the way to get it pristine, there's a lot of methods to get the first bunch of solder off. But after that, when you get to refining it, you need to really pay attention to what's going on and whether you've got rumples in there, whether you're putting things in there, you know, how that's working. Any other questions?
I have a question, Deb. And it's solder removal, but not with the file. What are your thoughts on using a wick to heat the solder and use the wick to draw some of the excess solder off whatever you're working on?
So that's a trick that's commonly used for electronic soldering, for really soft soldering. I've tried it with our soldering, and I would say that it works only if you have a huge mess. I mean, you would have to have if there's a lot of solder there that you've got to get off, that works. So for those of you who don't know what we're talking about, I don't have it with me right now, but you can buy some. It's usually copper, and it's really tiny wires. They've got to be like 36 gauge wires or something, and they're braided together, and you can touch it to the solder when the solder's flowing, and it will, because of capillary action, the solder will wick up that tiny thing and get off the piece that it's on. It still leaves a lot of solder on your piece. But on some of the solder blobs that I was showing you, that could be a potential one. I tend to make a mess with those. I tend not to use them, but I'm not saying that it's not beneficial. And especially if you've got a really big blob of solder, it could be very beneficial. Mm-hmm.
If you do the wicking, do you run the risk of that solder spreading out into a larger area on your flat piece?
Absolutely. I do that all the time if I use it. Mm-hmm. It spreads out, and then I accidentally take the wick and smear it on the piece. So now I've got a bigger area than I had to start with. And then, so I tend to make a mess with it. I don't know. It's not something I'm comfortable with. Maybe if I did it more, I would be more comfortable with it, and it would work better. I know for electronic soldering, it works quite well. And for Stay Bright and for the lower temp stuffs, it works even better. It works quite well for that. For our higher temp solder, I'm not as thrilled with it, but I'm not saying don't do it. And all of these things, guys, these are just things for you to know, so that you can try it and you can put it out there and you can see if it works for you. I'm just telling you what works for me. Any other questions? Nothing? Oh, we're going to have perfectly clean solder joints all the time now. I'm so glad. All right. Thank you very much for joining me today for Studio Time with Deb, the online version. And I will see you next week.